Oh my gosh, my hair is getting really long. Hey guys, it's Calvin and I have a secret to tell you. It's a deep, dark secret. Well, I guess it's not a secret anymore since you probably already read it in the title. But for those of you who don't know, I am a longtime iOS user. I've had 3 different iPhones in the past and I just recently upgraded to the iPhone XR if you haven't seen my last video. But if you did manage to go and watch my last video, some of you, if you had a very careful eye, you might have noticed a secret device sitting on my desk behind me in that last video. So in this video, I want to tell you guys what that device is, why I bought it, and my thoughts on Android, the likes and the dislikes, coming from an iOS user's perspective. So here it is. This is the LG G6, and yes, it is an Android device, if you don't already know that. So, this phone is a 5.7-inch LCD panel. It has a 2880 by 1440 resolution, and it's a very sharp display. It's very sharp compared to a lot of iOS devices. It has a Snapdragon 821 processor. It has 4 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of internal storage, and of course, with most Android devices, it does have expandable storage. It's got a 3300 milliamp hour battery. It's got a fingerprint sensor on the back. It's got 2 dual cameras on the back. One is actually a wide-angle lens. And I've learned that even in the Android world, this is a phone that kind of got overshadowed by another device that came out a little later that year in 2017. That was the Samsung Galaxy S8. That phone was a gorgeous phone. It had an amazing screen, lots of cool features. It also had the 2:1 aspect ratio, the same aspect ratio that this phone has. But this phone was running a slightly lower end processor from Qualcomm, and the screen was still an LCD panel. Now we know that Samsung makes some amazing displays, and because of that curved edge display, the almost bezel-less design, everything about the S8 overshadowed this phone. Now, this phone is a decent phone. It is a good phone, and I think from my time using it, the LG software was pretty good. And I know some people will have their likes and dislikes about the LG software. Of course, I had mine as well, but you know, overall, this was a decent phone. This was a really good phone that came out in 2017, but unfortunately was overshadowed by the S8. So, why do I have an Android device if I am primarily an iOS user? So I bought this phone in the summer of 2018, so a little more than a year after this thing first came out. And at the time, I had actually broken my iPhone 6 that I had at the time. The screen got completely cracked, and I didn't want to invest any more money into the iPhone 6 because I was like, well, I'll probably upgrade sooner or later. So I started to look into phones, and I started to look into iPhone, and I actually also started to look into Android phones. And there were 2 primary reasons that I wanted this phone, or just an Android device in general, and one of which, I love technology. I've been following Google I/O and Apple's WWDC events and all the product reveal events for a very long time, and Android was something I've always wanted to try. And the second reason, probably the most important reason, is, fun fact, I actually work with Android development. So I actually write and develop Android apps. That's kind of weird, right? Because I'm an iOS user and I got into Android development, and it's a bit of a long story, but hey, if you guys maybe want a video on that, I can kind of give you my background on what I do and how I got into it and everything. I'd be glad to do that. But long story short, I do work with Android apps, so I thought it would be best to actually have a physical device that I could test and debug and do all that Android stuff on. Now, I use this phone as a primary device for, I can do math, I swear, I think it was 4 months, about 4 months, and that was a pretty good length of time to try out a device. My SIM card was in here. I was using this thing as a primary device for about 4 months. And just my initial thoughts, there were a lot of things that I really loved about this phone. There were things that I liked about the phone, and then there were other things that I sort of disliked. And overall, I think Android is a great operating system. This phone was a pretty decent phone, but I think I prefer iOS and iPhone right now. And that's just it. It's just a preference. I don't think Apple is better than Android or Android is better than iPhone. I just think it's a preference. There are things that I like about iOS that provide me more value than what I would get on maybe this G6 or a similar Android device. So let's actually get into it. Let's get into the likes and the dislikes. Okay, we'll start off with all the bad things, the stuff that I didn't really like about this phone while I was using it. Number one, the battery. This is a 3300 milliamp hour battery, and from day one, it was giving me way less than a day's worth of charge on moderate use. That's a problem because I come from iOS and a lot of iPhones have really good battery life. Now my iPhone 6 at the time when I bought this phone, I think the iPhone had like an 1800 milliamp hour battery or something like that. That phone after 2.5 years was still giving me a better battery life than this thing, and I just bought this thing. Now, I did upgrade the battery, or I switched out the battery. I wanted a fresh new battery, and for a few weeks it actually gave me pretty good battery life. I could get a little bit more than a day, about a day and a half worth of moderate use, and then it started shrinking back down. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the battery, maybe it was the firmware, I don't know. But the battery life on this thing was one thing I disliked. The next thing, some apps and some of the features in this phone and the software, they seemed a bit laggy, and from time to time they would actually crash a little bit. I tested a few different apps, including Instagram, Tidal, and even Google Maps, and I found that on iOS they were actually performing better. There were less crashing, there were less laggy features about them than on this thing. Now, one thing that was really surprising was Google Maps, even on this phone, sometimes they would have text that was stretched out, or sometimes Google Maps would actually crash, and that was a little bit surprising because Google makes Android. I would have thought that Google Maps, of all apps, would be totally fine on Android, but there were a few cases that it wasn't. And again, maybe this was just a problem with LG's own software skin on top of Android that was causing those issues. I don't know, but even stuff like Instagram, sometimes when I would refresh Instagram, it would just stay loading, and I noticed that I didn't have that problem on iOS, as well as some other times where I would actually click stuff and it would not actually take me to a certain picture or post or whatever. Okay, the third thing, alert slider. It's 2018, well, it's 2019 right now, and still so many Android devices don't have an alert slider. And if you don't know what an alert slider is, it's basically a little switch or a slider on the side of the phone that can easily turn your phone from silent to vibrate to sound on, or ringtone on. I think the only phone that I know of personally, and I'm sure there are a few others that do have an alert slider on an Android device, is the OnePlus series. I think that's awesome. Now, if you have an iPhone, you know what I'm talking about. There's a little switch that you can easily switch from silent to sound on. I think that's a great feature. This phone doesn't have it, and it's one thing I actually missed about iPhone. Okay, the next thing, fluidity and just the general navigation and gestures between switching apps and going to your home screen and everything about the navigation. I think on iOS it's a little bit more fluid and a little bit more smooth. I noticed that gestures and navigation and even scrolling didn't feel as smooth and clean on this phone as it did on an iOS phone or an iPhone. Obviously that has something to do with the software, whether it's LG's own skin or Android itself, and of course the hardware. Sometimes I would scroll on this phone and it's just a little bit laggy, it's not precise and accurate, and it's not really a huge deal breaker. It was just something that I didn't really enjoy because I had an iPhone and I knew what that experience was like. And again, maybe it's just a bit of a bias. I'm just so used to iPhone that maybe that sort of scrolling and gestures caught on to me, but it was one thing I didn't really like on this phone. And speaking of fluidity, memory management. This thing has 4 gigs of RAM, and yet I noticed better performance on my iPhone 6 that I think is slated only to have 1 gig of RAM. Obviously, Apple controls the hardware and the software, so you'll get a really nice optimized experience on iPhone, but I figured that with 4 times as much RAM and newer hardware that this would perform a little bit better. It actually didn't. And it wasn't super slow or super laggy or anything, but I noticed that difference coming from iPhone 6. Okay, the next thing, updates. Oh my gosh, iOS, we get updates on day 1. This thing, I think, is still rocking Oreo, and Android Pie, or Android P, was released over the summer, I think, and some phones are slowly starting to adopt it. This thing still does not have Android 9.0, which is Android Pie. It's a little frustrating, and again, I think this is just something I'm spoiled with. Coming from an iPhone background, we get iOS updates all the time on day 1, and we never have to wait more than a few days to actually update our phones to the next major version of iOS. I think another thing that I didn't really like about this device was just the apps and how the design and everything feels about the apps. So I think on iOS, a lot of the apps and how they're designed is a little bit more consistent, so they do feel familiar from app to app, and that's partially because Apple has really strict guidelines on what they accept to the App Store and what they don't. So when you go to the App Store on an Apple device, you'll notice that it's not maybe as big as what's on Google Play Store. On Google Play Store, if you search up one type of an app, you'll get hundreds of results of many different apps doing essentially the same thing. For an example, if you come from a mathematics background and you needed a simple linear interpolator calculator, you could type that into Google Play Store and you'll get so many different results, and in a way that might make it seem a little bit more bloated. But the one thing I really missed about iPhone was there was a smaller selection of apps, yes, but they, for the most part, were designed well. Now, there are apps obviously on iOS that are designed very poorly and very bad, but I think the experience of just the App Store and the apps and the design and everything, I just preferred it on iOS, that's all. Okay, so enough about the dislikes. Let's talk about the things that I loved and liked. Okay, so the first thing that I really liked about this phone and just Android overall, customization. Android has this down. Android does an awesome job of customization. You can customize the home screen with widgets, where you want your apps. Almost everything about the UI you can customize on Android. And that is very powerful, because on iOS, we're still generally using the same layout as we did with the very first iPhone. And Apple has been introducing little widgets and stuff like on one side of the screen, but your main screen and the screens after that on iOS, it's just apps. But the cool thing about Android is you can place all those apps into a small folder. You can have certain apps appear at certain places on the screen. You can have widgets, you can have dynamic UI elements, you can have all sorts of stuff. And that gives way to making really clean setups on an Android device. So hey, if you guys want to see maybe a dark, clean, and minimal setup on my Android device, that would be a pretty fun video to make. Let me know. And of course, the customization on Android may not be for everybody, but for those who really value it and would like to use it, it is there. And for those people who don't generally care too much about it, you don't have to use it. You can just use the default settings, and I think it's a fine experience. Okay, another thing, customizing actual app icons. This is really cool. Now, I know very few iOS apps actually have the ability to change the icon if you go into that app's particular settings, but on Android, you can customize all the icons on all your apps by simply just downloading an icon pack and individually assigning app icons, or getting your launcher, whatever type of launcher that you're using, to actually assign certain app icons for your apps. That is really cool. Because again, if you're creating like a clean and minimal setup, you can pick the perfect icon for your apps and have them displayed on your home screen or even in your app drawer. And that's exactly what I have here. I don't know, I just think it's really fun. It adds a bit of personality to your phone, and that's really cool. Android does a very good job of that. Okay, the next thing, widgets. You can add so many different widgets on your Android device, on your home screen, on your other screens, at all sorts of places. So you can have things from weather to to-do lists to, directions to your home, Google Maps, your photos. There are so many cool widgets that you can have right on your app screen or your home screen. I got another notification, okay. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about widgets. They are cool, they're awesome, and I think for power users, Android treats them very well. Okay, another thing. I actually really like the camera on the LG G6, mainly because of the features that were integrated into the camera app for the G6. There's a lot of cool camera features on the G6. You have things like manual mode if you want to completely take control of how you take your pictures. You have jump cuts, you have 2-in-1s. So LG actually takes advantage of this 2:1 display aspect ratio, and you can actually have two pictures being taken, one from the back and one from the front at the same time, which I think is really cool. It has food filters, it has wide angle support, and just all sorts of other stuff. So camera features, I think, on the G6, as well as Android devices and Android apps that support camera, they're really cool. And because of that, I think it's a really great way to take advantage of the camera hardware on these devices. So Android, good job on the camera stuff. Okay, next. I think this is one of my favorite features on Android, and to some of you guys it may not be super special or anything, but the feature that I think I love above everything on an Android device is the notification center. The notification center on Android is amazing. It is so well done, and Android's had a lot of time to perfect it and make it what it is today. I think notifications on Android are just light years ahead of what's on iOS. Now in iOS, with iOS 12, we finally got grouped notifications, and we got the ability to actually change settings and certain things about those notifications right there at the notification. But I think Android just does it so well. The notification center on Android provides a lot of useful information, and even with that information, you can do so many things, and you can interact with a certain app's notification very well. It's way more interactive. You can reply, you can do certain app functions within that notification, you can manage your notifications there, and I think notifications on Android are just more useful. There are other things too. So if you have your music playing, your notifications will actually showcase the artwork as well as playback controls right there in the notification center. Now iOS has that as well on the home screen, but I think it's just a little bit more beautiful on Android because you get to see the cover art and the text change, and everything about it is really, really cool. Another thing on notifications is dynamic size. So in iOS, generally your notifications are all the same size, but on Android, if you only have a simple notifications, let's say your weather app is telling you what the temperature is going to be for today in your city, it's only going to take up a small portion of your notification center as opposed to your standard size notification in your notification tray. And if you want more information, you can tap on it and it will expand to more information. That's really cool. And it also has recommended content. So if you're working inside an app and if there's a certain feature or functionality that is quickly accessible or you think should be quickly accessible, it'll probably be in your notification tray in Android. And I've actually used this quite a bit when I'm doing Android development. So when I'm testing certain apps, I can actually pin an app in the notification center or in the notification tray so I can quickly access certain features of the app. That's really, really useful. So yeah, Notification Center, I think, is one of my favorite features about Android, and I think it's very, very well implemented. Okay, the last thing I really like about Android devices is that I'm glad that Android devices can adopt universal standards fairly quickly in their hardware. The biggest example in this case would be USB Type-C. This is USB-C on my G6, and a lot of other Android devices support that same universal connection. It blows my mind that it's 2019 and still Apple has not switched from Lightning to a USB Type-C connection for their iPhones. They've already switched in their Mac. They've already switched in their new iPad Pros, yet they're still keeping Lightning on their iPhones. It's almost a bit frustrating because now I have to carry around two different cables, and I think the USB Type-C port is just more versatile and it's way more useful and you can do a lot more stuff with it. I don't know what Apple's doing. Hopefully in their 2019 iPhones they do finally switch to USB Type-C, but that is one of my favorite features about Android, is that these devices can adopt those types of standards fairly quickly, and it just makes it a little bit more convenient for the end user. Okay, so that is my experience with this Android device and just Android for the first time as an iOS user. There are a lot of things I really loved about the phone. There was some stuff that I disliked. Overall, I think it's a great phone and Android is a great operating system and platform. However, I think right now I still prefer iOS. And again, just like I said before, it's just a preference. And hey, if you want, maybe I can make a video about all the things that I really like about iOS and why I choose to make it my primary device right now. But does that mean I'm always going to be an iPhone user? Maybe not, probably not. I really think the arguments that people have between Android and iOS are a little bit silly. I personally just love technology, and I think both platforms have really, really good things about them as well as things that could be improved. Now, there is one phone in the Android world that I am very, very excited about, and it's a phone that I haven't been as excited about as I was with like the iPhone 6. The iPhone 6 was a pretty big step up in design and just the operating, everything about that phone was a step up from what Apple was doing prior to the iPhone 6. Now, the phone that I'm super, super excited about in the Android world is the OnePlus 6, the OnePlus 16, I think upcoming, the OnePlus 7. I think OnePlus as a company, they are really listening to the consumer and they're trying to bring out the best product they can with the greatest features for a really cost-effective price point. And they do a lot of stuff that actually mimics Apple. The company as a whole, they value speed and performance, and they make some really gorgeous looking hardware. They make some really nice looking phones. And above all that, I think the one thing that I really liked about iOS that Apple does well is that they optimize iOS for their hardware. And what OnePlus is doing is they're taking stock Android and they're optimizing it for their hardware. So yeah, they do have a skin around it, but they're not shoving all these extra features and things that eventually cause the phone to slow down and have issues with updates and all that. They're taking Android and they're making it faster. That is incredible. We don't need a million new features. We want a solid, stable phone, a solid, stable operating system that does what we need it to do very well. And I think OnePlus has the right idea about all of this. So I am super excited for OnePlus. So yeah, I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for OnePlus. I'm definitely excited to see what they're going to bring in their future phones and their future platform. And that's about it. That's my experience with Android. So there you have it. That is my secret Android device. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are a lot of things I, again, liked and disliked about Android as well as iPhone. And again, I've said this a few times already. It just comes down to preference. Whatever you prefer, whatever stuff that you value in a phone, go for that. Okay, so let me know if you guys ever experienced a switch between iOS and Android and what your initial thoughts about it more. And please don't hate on other platforms down in the comments. If you're gonna do that, go somewhere else. Don't waste your time here. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I'll see you guys down in the comments. I really love talking to you guys, so please leave a comment and I will catch you guys in the next one. Hello? Hi, Tim Cook? Yes, I have a message for you. Please switch to USB Type-C.